Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this session, Domestic Discord, Global Expectations, Will the American Eagle Fly? My name is Lynn Kwok, and as Samir just pointed out, I'm Shangri-La Dialogue Senior Fellow for Asia-Pacific Security at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and I'll be moderating this session. I'd like to start, of course, by giving thanks to the hosts and the organizers of this great event. It's truly wonderful to be back in person at this really pulsing event, and I'm very glad to be here as well with all my fellow panelists. At its heart, the session today questions whether the United States can sustain its dominant position in the world, or whether the fabric supporting this dominance is coming apart at the seams under various external and internal pressures. Joining me to discuss this important question, and I'll quickly just run through my panelists again. To my right, Carl Bildt. He was former Prime Minister of Sweden and co-chair of the European Council on Foreign Relations. Ashok Malik is two seats from the right-hand side. Policy Advisor, Ministry of External Affairs, India. Dr. Shen Ming-Shih, Acting Deputy Chief Executive Officer and Director, Division of National Security Research, Institute for National Defense and Security Research, Taiwan. Dr. Daniel Twining, he's President of the International Republican Institute in the United States. And Lisa Curtis, Senior Fellow and Director, Indo-Pacific Security Program, Center for New American Security, also based in the United States. A very warm welcome to all of you as well. Now, the US has put working in common cause with its closest allies and partners at the center of advancing its national interests. And so the strength of US ties with its allies and partners, as well as the strength of its allies and partners themselves, matter. Carl Bildt, could you tell me how the crisis in Ukraine has impacted America's ties with Europe?
Well, in short, fairly fundamentally, of course. I think it can be said, if you take a somewhat longer perspective on what's been happening in the last year, we were perhaps not overly impressed by the way in which the Americans handled the rather quick exodus from Afghanistan, and that had repercussions for us as well. But if you look at the handling of the Russia crisis, because that's what we are dealing with, I think they use this flying eagle thing. We are flying together, closer than we've been for a very long time indeed. It has been by necessity coming together, handling what is today full-scale conventional war in a significant part of Europe, with major ramifications across all aspects of security. So what we will see is, I think, a significant strengthening of the transatlantic security relationship, and significant strengthening of NATO, significant strengthening of the EU, significant strengthening of EU-NATO relationships by necessity, because it's only in this way that we can handle the full ramifications of the war that is now going on. So the birds are flying.
So the birds are flying, but in what direction?
In the right direction.
In the right direction, yes. But has strengthened transatlantic ties, strengthened NATO, has that also translated into more effective engagement in the Indo-Pacific, which the United States has identified as a priority theater for it moving forwards?
It probably will, but it's too early to tell. By necessity, the focus is now on handling the acute war, and that will be the focus until, well, I wish I had a more concrete answer to that. So that's been and that is the focus. It has some sort of obvious impacts upon the Indo-Pacific. Notably, it had an impact on the relationship with China. There was an EU-China summit, a virtual one, a couple of weeks ago, and it was somewhat more chilly in the atmosphere than otherwise had been the case, because of the fact that sort of Russians, also the Chinese, have been abstaining, not supporting in the UN, not alone in that, by the way, to make that obvious side comment, but they have been sort of overtly supportive of the Russians in other respects, and that has an impact. But of course, what we've seen in this Raisina dialogue with Ursula von der Leyen coming here with the major policy speech and with setting up the Trade and Technology Council between the EU and India is significant. I remember going back in the history of Raisina dialogue some years, the European presence here was fairly limited. Now the European presence here in terms of policy discussions and senior politicians and foreign ministers is fairly massive. So we do see a gradual increase in the European engagement in the Indo-Pacific. It's going to be somewhat more China, somewhat more India, and somewhat less China as a result of the conflict that we're having at the moment.
But of course, engagement in the Indo-Pacific has to stretch across, both economics as well as security, and both the United States as well as Europe, especially Europe, is very much focused in the European sphere, understandably so. Some have talked about a long war there. Can Europe actually afford to be too bogged down in Europe in the long term if it also identifies that there are certain opportunities and challenges in the Indo-Pacific? Ursula von der Leyen, in her opening address here, actually talked about how what is happening in Europe is as important for the Indo-Pacific region as for Europe. Could we not equally say then that the Indo-Pacific region, given the challenges to the rule of law there, are also as important for Europe as for the Indo-Pacific?
Well, you can certainly argue that case, but we have an acute war. I mean, people are dying on a minute-by-minute basis, and bridges are being blown up, and airstrikes are being conducted, and so there's some. And we have millions of refugees flowing across our borders, not on a daily basis, but on a weekly basis. So it's obvious that for policymakers at the moment, that's the issue that have to be dealt with. I think there's a deep awareness of the issues in this part of the world. And if you look at the EU policies, I mean, EU doesn't operate aircraft carriers and nuclear weapons, as you know, but it operates the economic equivalent of that in terms of trade policies, more than the US does, by the way, which is sort of retreated from that part of the geopolitical battles. And we are underway with new negotiations with trade agreements with several places, and have the implementation of significant trade agreements, Korea, Japan, a lot of Asian countries, Australia, New Zealand in the final stages. The beginning of trade negotiations with India, which is quite remarkable, because India has been, as we all know, a fairly difficult customer, to put it in those terms, when it comes to trade negotiations. So the fact, and a lot of the battle at the moment, as we see, for influence, is as a geostrategic battle with the military component, needless to say, but there's a geo-economic battle that is as significant long term. And there the EU is, of course, the most significant power that is acting also in the Indo-Pacific sphere.
Thank you. I think I'll move now on to Ashok Malik. India is one, as we've heard repeatedly at this dialogue, India is one of the United States' most important partners, especially in the Indo-Pacific. And however, India hasn't always been fully on board with US initiatives as well as the US position on various issues. It was slow on the uptake on this quadrilateral security dialogue, and now there are divergences on Russia as well. On the issue of Russia, the United States frames this as a battle between autocracies against democracies. It doesn't seem, though, that India perceives the Ukraine-Russia crisis in the same way. How does India frame the Russia-Ukraine crisis?
Before I answer your question, I would like to pick a bone on Quad. We were not slow on the uptake in Quad. If anything, the rejuvenation of Quad in the past 3 years has been driven by India. I would say Washington has played catch-up, with due respects. Coming to the Ukraine crisis, we've taken a principled position in India, which is frankly no different from any other civilized country, that war is not a solution. The war must stop. There should be a ceasefire, and there should be talks leading to some sort of a solution. In terms of the framing from Washington that you refer to, look, India and the US both use the English language. We are approaching the Ukraine crisis using the same language, but we are using different operational dictionaries, different geopolitical, historical, and strategic dictionaries. Washington's framing comes from its historical, geopolitical, and strategic dictionary. Our framing comes from our geopolitical, historic, and strategic dictionary. Just as, I suppose, throwing democracy under the bus in Afghanistan came from another geopolitical, strategic, and historical dictionary.
So just so that I understand, I'm clear on what you're saying. So does India frame what's going on in Ukraine as democracies against, authoritarian states against democracies?
We frame it as a war that is definitely avoidable and should end soon.
Okay. Of course, we've had India take what you've just called a principled position. It's asked for the war to come to an end. It's condemned the humanitarian situation as well. However, it hasn't actually condemned Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Could I just ask whether you think that strengthens China's hands? I think Minister Jaishankar, in his opening speech, actually made clear that as a strategically autonomous actor, India will act in its national interest, and I think that's perfectly understandable. But my question to you is whether or not it really is in India's national interest to refuse to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine. After all, it was your own former Minister of State for External Affairs who has gone on record as saying that it is in no one's interest to condone such behavior. And if the Chinese march into our country, meaning India, we want others to stand up for us. We should stand up and be counted on the right side of this. So yes, India, as all other countries, is entitled to act in accordance with its national interests. But how do you perceive that the failure to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine is actually in India's interests?
You know, I'm not sure I follow, because whether it comes to China's actions in the recent past in South Asia, in Ladakh or elsewhere, or to what's happening in Ukraine, sorry, is that better? Whether it comes to China's actions in recent years in Ladakh or elsewhere in Asia, or what's happening in Ukraine, we've taken a very principled position: adherence to the UN Charter, adherence to international law, adherence to the territorial integrity of nations and states, and adherence to sovereignty. Those principles are absolute. We've stated them repeatedly at the United Nations in the context of Ukraine as well. We've stated them in the context of what's happening in Ladakh to our Chinese interlocutors without much of an impact, unfortunately. But those positions are absolutely crystal clear. We are, as I said, approaching the issue using different dictionaries perhaps, but we're actually saying the same thing. We are not in favor of this war. We are not in favor of what's happening.
But there's still a refusal to condemn. So you accept those principles, but what you infer from acceptance of those principles is slightly different.
Perhaps Indians articulate their anxieties, their outrage, their principles differently from Americans do. Americans are different.
Sure.
I might add, it's not only Americans, it's 141 nations around the world. Among which Americans, has to be said.
Perhaps now I'd like to turn to Ming-Shih.
Yes.
There's been plenty of talk on social media, for instance, about how it's Ukraine today, Taiwan tomorrow. Do you think that what's happened with Russia-Ukraine, whether this has emboldened China in the context of Taiwan, and do you think that this conflict has actually increased or decreased the chances of a Chinese military invasion of Taiwan?
Yes. When the Ukraine war breaking from February 24, many Taiwan people are very concerned about this situation. We have a survey investigation. Before war breaking, we have 40.3% people support the defense and support the defense reforms and willing to fight to defend our homeland. And after war breaking, they are shoot up to the 70.2% people. And of course, as Lim said, many people talking about even in TV show, today's Ukraine, tomorrow Taiwan, today Russia, tomorrow China. So many people concerned about this and where to be a drive force to push government, to push Minister of National Defense to procure more weapon system and to do more defense reform, such as our mobilization reform. Of course, our reform is started from several years ago, maybe 2020 or even 2016. You can see that we plan to buy more weapon systems like M1A2T, F-16V, and we made our own submarine. It all started from that time. So I think the implication to Taiwan of this war is it confirm and increase the people about that, how to defend Taiwan. And the second implication is, I think, is to the China. You can see that many media said that China, because of the Ukraine war, because the United States support the Ukraine, made China postpone or change their war plan to Taiwan. Or maybe this change is two-way, is okay, it's too difficult, so I postpone the date. But the second way is take the lesson of Russia and Ukraine and improve. Especially, we know that Russia have the so-called battalion tactic group. And in China, PLA Army, they have a so-called combined battalion. I think the idea is the same. But why Russia Army defeated in Ukraine and China can improve? So I think these two implications is very important to Taiwan and to the maybe United States or the international society.
So you're saying that in terms of China's own assessment of its capabilities, China would have to reassess its own capabilities in light of the rout that Russia is now facing in Ukraine?
Yes. You can say that you can see that many media report in first 3 days of the China's media, they're very happy that Russia attacked and invade Ukraine, and even say 3 days will end the war. But when the war postponed to or delayed to the 1 month, 2 months, many China media or some of the media revealed that if Russia this result when China invade Taiwan is the same. Of course, in Taiwan, also think about that. Why Ukraine can defeat Russia military? I think we just published a booklet named All Out Defense Manual and Booklet. Also, our government encouraged the people, even the military, in the civil defense, how to integrate it together to defend our land.
Could I ask you, though, prior to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, was the Taiwanese assessment that China would invade Taiwan very high? Because I think most analysts, I mean, there was, of course, the analyst who said, China is going to invade Taiwan imminently or, within the next 7 years. But of course, I think the majority or the preponderance of analysts actually suggested that China would not invade Taiwan until it could be sure of a quick victory. So prior to the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, what was Taiwan's assessment?
Okay, we prepared the defense not because of Ukraine war breaking. We prepared the war or prepared that China will invade Taiwan is from 1949. Yeah, so you can see that media economics say Taiwan is most dangerous area. But you can see that even this media report, but our stock market not down, and our currency not down because we already prepare. We think about that. If China have enough capability and in the right timing, he will invade Taiwan, but not now, because we know this year is a 20-party Congress. Xi Jinping right is very busy, just Professor Gooden said, is very busy in domestic affair, and also pandemic control is out of control right now.
Yeah.
So we don't think so that China will use the chance Russia attack Ukraine and then invade Taiwan.
So the trick then is to keep Xi Jinping very busy with domestic affairs in China.
Yes. Yeah.
How, in the event that China does attack Taiwan militarily, is Taiwan confident that the United States will come to Taiwan's aid militarily?
Yes, I think Taiwan is situation different from Ukraine. United States have Taiwan Relation Act, of course have sex assurance. You also can see that Congress in each year, NDAA also will sign some article and support Taiwan to help Taiwan. You can also see from media yesterday, Blinken in the Congress also say because whole world semiconductor 90% is produced in Taiwan, and because Taiwan's geostrategic value in the first island chain, because Taiwan is the democracy symbol of the whole world, and because Taiwan importance in supply chains. So I think Taiwan situation is different from Ukraine.
And also, of course, if the United States failed to come to Taiwan's aid militarily, then its system of alliances in Asia might collapse as well, because everyone would doubt U.S. credibility. Daniel Twining, I'd like to turn to you now, please. Another means, we've so far talked about how alliances strengthen the United States, globally as well as regionally in the Indo-Pacific, but also another source of U.S. strength, of course, is its democracy. Could you tell me how the events of January the 6th have hurt the United States' efforts to build democracy both at home as well as abroad?
Thanks, Lynn. Pleasure to be here with all of you, including especially our Indian friends. Thanks, ORF and MEA, for bringing us back to India. So look, we all have our domestic issues. You've seen them in the United States, you've seen them in India, you've seen them in France, etc. I think we have to make sure that these do not distract us from what we need to do strategically in the world, which is for democracies to concert much more closely. Just before this session, I was looking at a list of the top 10 economies in the world by GDP. Guess what? Only 2 are not American military allies. Those 2 countries are China and India. India, of course, is a very strong strategic and military partner with the United States. China is isolated, in fact, in terms of its power capabilities. Russia was number 11 before the war in Ukraine. I suspect it's not going to be number 11 after the war in Ukraine. There's a scenario where Russia as a great power is something we talk about in the past tense. It's not even clear Russia's a great power anymore, depending on how the Ukraine conflict unfolds. America is very lucky. One of our greatest sources of strength is our democratic alliances and partnerships around the world. Those democratic alliances and partnerships have grown, not diminished, over the previous period. It's very interesting. There have been a lot of forecasts of American decline, including, I think, in the way that this panel has been framed. I did go back and check the numbers. In 1980, the U.S. share of global GDP was about 25%. In 1995, the U.S. share of global GDP was about 25%. And in 2020, the last time they measured it, the U.S. share of global GDP was about 25%. So I think there's a real story of democratic resiliency that you see not just in America, but in India and in Europe and many, many countries. And there's a story of democratic strength. America is so lucky to have the democratic friends and partners that we do, and I think we all collectively have to think about how do we strengthen our competitiveness for this new era of authoritarian aggression that Russia has launched on the world.
You mentioned that the United States' source of strength is democratic alliances and partnership, but But it's not just alliances and partnerships with democracies that the US has sought to forge. In Southeast Asia, for instance, one of its important partners is Vietnam, Singapore. There are various other important countries that it's seeking to forge stronger ties with because it's important strategically for the United States. So this brings me to my next question, namely whether you think this framing of democracies versus authoritarian states is actually the best means by which the United States should be framing the geopolitical contest that's going on. And if I could just raise three factors for your consideration as you consider this question. First, we've seen a bit of the ambivalence of India's position in the context of Russia. Second, there's also the possible argument that this framing has pushed Russia and China closer together. And third, this framing also sits quite uncomfortably, as I highlighted, with some countries that the United States has sought to build friendships or partnerships with. Say in Southeast Asia, there are several illiberal democracies, backsliding democracies, as well as authoritarian states. So really, is this the best framing moving forwards? We're not talking about, building strength within America or support for America's foreign policy within America. We're talking about how best can it forge alliances and stronger alliances and partnerships abroad.
So it is a great way to build support for American leadership in the world in the United States. Just to take that, and then I'll come to your question. Polling shows that over 80% of Americans believe we should defend not just Ukraine, we should defend democracies under attack by authoritarian powers. So I would say, of course, that includes India in the context of Chinese aggression against India. That certainly includes our friends in NATO and our allies in Asia. So it is a useful framing mechanism in the United States. More substantively, I like to think about it the way I think we in America thought about the Cold War, which was that the United States and our friends and allies led a free world coalition, right? In that free world coalition were many countries that were not democracies. They included military dictatorships in places like South Korea and Taiwan, which were excellent allies and democratized over time, opened up over time. So I think we can make a distinction, actually, when the Japanese coined the idea of a free and open Indo-Pacific, I think we can make a distinction, countries that want to live in a free and open international system versus countries that want to live in a system of authoritarian spheres of influence with imperial control from Beijing or Moscow. And I'm 100% sure that most countries in the world, including most of them represented here, want to live in a free and open international system because, of course, that's the surest guarantor of their sovereignty and their prosperity.
If I could add something there, I don't disagree with the idealism that Dan uses. We all want to live in a free and open international system. But the real world is actually about a series of imperfections, different shades of imperfections. So looking at putting everything into a very tight dualism box, black and white, doesn't always work. I'm not suggesting we shouldn't defend democracy, but what do you do when you deal with different shades of imperfect democracies? You pick and choose. So I'm not sure such framing always works all the time for every issue.
So I agree with you, but I think how it works is we work with friends and allies, and over time we discover that our closest friends and allies and partners are open societies, right? And I worked on the U.S. normalization of relations with Vietnam in the 1990s. Vietnam is an excellent partner, but our relationship is always going to be limited. Our security partnership is always going to be limited by the nature of its political regime. But over time, of course, that can change, as it's changed across Asia.
There is, of course, the question of whether or not limiting that partnership might mean opening up strategic space for countries like China. But we'll leave it at that, because I'd like to now turn to Elisa Curtis. Lisa, you were quoted in an NDTV report earlier this month saying that Russia-Ukraine was straining the relationship between the United States and India. Do you think that these strains are going to hurt the United States Indo-Pacific strategy, especially its ability for the Quad to work shoulder to shoulder?
Well, you mentioned the Indo-Pacific strategy, and first let me talk a little bit about that because I think it's very important. First was the timing of the release of the strategy, February 11th, 1 week after the major pact between Russia and China was announced, 2 weeks before Russia invaded Ukraine. So clearly the U.S. is signaling that China remains the most important long-term national security concern for the United States. This was also indicated in the National Defense Strategy, which of course the whole strategy has not been released yet, but the sort of summary of the document made clear that China remains the number one national security concern for the United States. But the Indo-Pacific strategy is extremely important. It lays out an affirmative agenda for the region in terms of having a vision, free, open, transparent, inclusive region, which I think is so important right now, and also laid out the importance of deterrence and working with allies and partners in the region in order to have a sort of networked deterrence to deter any type of aggression in the region. It also highlighted the Quad as a central pillar of the Indo-Pacific strategy. And of course, the Quad was revived under the Trump administration in 2017. The Biden administration has taken it to the next level, advanced the momentum. We've already seen 3 leader-level Quad meetings, 2 virtual, 1 in person. And it also highlighted the important role of India and talked about India being a driver of the Quad, being an important economic and political power in the region. So I think it's clear that the United States values its partnership with India. It places great priority on its relationship with India. You could see that in the 2+2 talks that took place last week, where the progress in the relationship was highlighted, new initiatives were talked about, and it was clear that the divergences over Russia were being set aside. Maybe not forever, but for the time being, the focus is on the importance of the U.S.-India strategic partnership. But I would just lay down a marker there for the future. And it kind of gets at some of the things that Dan mentioned. And it is, there is a time and a place for neutrality, but there can also be costs to neutrality. And here I would quote a recent piece by a friend back in Washington, Dan Blumenthal. And he recently wrote in the Wall Street Journal that China is watching very closely what is happening in Russia's war in Ukraine. And that in terms of what China wants to do, or possibly plans to do in the region, asserting its hegemony, taking increasingly aggressive action, perhaps even against Taiwan, it doesn't need allies. It only needs countries to stay neutral. So I think we need to think about that and think about some of the costs of neutrality. And I would also point to Singapore's very important statements in this regard. Singapore, of course, has come out supporting sanctions against Russia. And Prime Minister Lee was very clear that being a smaller country, smaller countries are the most vulnerable when countries try to assert the Midas right theory for global order. And so he was very, very clear on why it was important for a country like Singapore to stand up against territorial aggression and the importance of territorial sovereignty.
Thank you. So I gather from what you just said that the Indo-Pacific region is too important right now too important to the United States for it to let differences with India in respect of Ukraine and Russia affect its long-term strategy in the region. Of course, its long-term strategy is not only one of security engagement with the region, but also needs to be, I suppose, one of economic engagement with the region. I think it's often said, I'm sure all of you have heard as well, that for the region, economics is security. We have yet to see the Biden administration's Indo-Pacific economic framework. But I wonder whether, given that it's anticipated to be issued in summer this year, I wonder whether it's a little bit of too little, too late. Countries in the region want market access, but that's already been ruled out by the United States. And on the other hand, you've got China, which has been deepening and widening its economic engagement with the region even before it launched its Belt and Road Initiative in 2013. So how would you, I guess, score the United States' performance in terms of the economic department, or its economic performance in terms of economic engagement in the region?
Well, I think you've made some really important points, Lynn, and I would have to be honest and say that this would probably be the weakest part of the Indo-Pacific strategy, the fact that an economic strategy has not been laid out yet. We keep hearing about the Indo-Pacific economic framework, but I think we were all hoping that would be part of the rollout of the Indo-Pacific strategy. But I think, there's a couple of issues. Obviously, the U.S. has not joined the CPTPP. It's become very much caught up in our own domestic politics, both in the Republican and Democratic Party. It's become associated with threatening worker rights, and this is not something that's going to be easily overcome. But I do think that there will be a framework laid out for the region. We've heard about some of the broad outlines that this will focus on the digital economy, so maybe looking at some digital trade agreements and getting countries to sign up to rules and regulations, resilient supply chains. And I think this is very important, because I think what countries saw during the pandemic was the importance of access, steady access, and a lot of those supply chains were threatened. So I think this is something that countries in the region care about, and this could be a very important part of the Indo-Pacific economic framework when it's rolled out. There are also mentions of clean energy. That's another issue that countries in the region are certainly interested in. Infrastructure, providing alternative options for infrastructure investment. We all know about the tremendous infrastructure needs in the region, but there needs to be access to investment that is transparent, that takes into account the communities in the region, and that doesn't cause countries to get over indebted. So I think there could be some interesting aspects to this Indo-Pacific economic framework, but I think you're right. The countries are also looking to market access, and this is just something that the U.S. needs to accept. So hopefully very soon we'll see the rollout of the Indo-Pacific economic framework, and it will be something that countries in the region will respond to positively.
I think you highlighted a very important point as well about infrastructure and the great infrastructure need in the region. However, in some respects, I feel that some of the U.S. initiatives in respect of infrastructure appear to be, I get a sense of deja vu. I've heard under the Trump administration, the Bildt Act, and then we had the trilateral partnership for infrastructure investment between the United States, Australia, and Japan. And then under now the Biden administration, we have the Build Back Better world. But so there appears a sense of, lots of initiatives, lots of ideas, but I don't see concrete results. And perhaps we need to wait a little while, but I wonder whether in this strategic competition, there is all that much time. But I'd like now to turn to the audience, who I'm sure have questions for our panelists. We don't have very much time, so I think what we will do is I will take a series of a few questions at once, perhaps, and if I could ask that you state your name as well as your affiliation when you ask your question, as well as state to whom your question is addressed. So the mics are on the floor, so please.
Hi. I'm Fei Fanling from Taiwan delegation. Again, want to ask a question and want to add one more point that, well, Dr. Shen just said that there are differences between Ukraine and Taiwan. I think that stance is actually the Taiwanese government stance, and also, I believe it's also the United States government stance. But I want to draw one more point is that the similarity between Ukraine and Taiwan is that we are all democracies. We are two democracies that are eager to defend our own sovereignty. We are two democracies that are eager to protect our own democratic institution. We are two democracies that are willing to play a bigger role in the international stage to help to maintain the stability and prosperity of the world. That's two similarities of Ukraine and Taiwan. I think that point I should be drawn. And I still have a question. My question is that many people are talking about we're not talking about the U.S. strategy, U.S. future on the international stage. But I wonder that in terms of deterring China, there's a discussion about the strategic ambiguity and strategic clarity. And I want to ask the panelists which way do you think is a better way to deter China? That's my question. Thank you very much.
I see a gentleman at the mic at the end. I'm afraid I can't see very well with the lights, but I see a gentleman there, please.
Yeah, am I audible? Yeah, hey, I'm Anshuman Hazarika. I'm a second year student at Delhi University, Political Science. So my question is to Daniel and Lisa. Either one can answer. So my question is like in this discussion panel, there was discussions on the rule-based order, free and open Indo-Pacific, and how military might is wrong to be used or territorial integrity needs to be maintained. And the discussion revolves around trust, right? Then my question is that USA has been very proactive in one thing that is the FONOPS, that is the Freedom of Navigation Operations, and they have been even conducting it in last few years in India's EEZ. So even though United States has never ratified the UNCLOS, unlike India, but still is very adamant on conducting these operations. So don't you think there is a contradiction in building trust in Indo-Pacific and still having such operations without ratifying a convention?
Thank you very much for your question. Next question, please.
Okay, thank you. My question is to the distinguished speaker from Taiwan. My name is Mohammed, and I am Egyptian, and I am with the Raisina Young Fellows. My question is about the identity of Taiwan. I am by no means an expert on Taiwan, so please excuse my ignorance if my question seems to you common knowledge. Till the present day, the official name of Taiwan is the Republic of China. Do you consider yourself Chinese? When, like the textbooks, the history textbooks in the school, do they tell the students that they are Chinese or otherwise? Thank you, sir.
And the gentleman here in the middle row.
Hello, I'm Chris Zalewski. I'm from Poland, from the Boime Institute. And I have one question to Ashok Malik, because we, as an institute, we issued a statement calling for a more decisive language for during the Ukraine crisis, during the first days of Ukraine crisis, and we wanted just to, let's say, a more decisive statement from India. And the response we get from our Indian friends is when we had a problem with Pakistan, when we had a problem with China, you did nothing. So what should we do in case of crisis with Pakistan or China to satisfy Indian needs?
Sorry, I didn't hear that question. Could you sort of...
yes. So should I repeat, or it's
I think the question, if I understood you correctly, sir, is what would India like to see from allies and partners in respect of Pakistan and issues with China, so that it won't, in a sense, retort that, why should we care about this because you didn't care about our needs in respect of Pakistan and China. Am I correct?
Yeah, it's correct. Sorry
look,
for the mic. I don't know how to...
Okay.
That's extremely unfair. We expect friendly countries such as Poland, and we regard Poland a good friend. Poland's really helped us get Indian students out of Ukraine, and there is a great appreciation in our system and our society for Poland. We expect countries like Poland, friends like Poland, to stand with us when we face problems, which indeed Poland does. In terms of what's happening in Ukraine, look, it's not that we don't care for what's happening in Ukraine. We've seen signs and pictures of a humanitarian crisis in Ukraine, and we have sympathy for that. We entirely understand that. We have provided assistance to Ukrainian refugees in more than one country. It's not that we are not alive to that. Of course we are. We have our geopolitical compulsions at our border. We all know that what that is. But it's not as if we are blind to what's happening to ordinary people and refugees in Ukraine. Not at all.
And Lisa wanted
I want to jump in because I really feel the need to put to rest this patently false idea, this narrative that somehow is making the rounds, that the U.S. was not supportive of India during its 2020 border crisis with China. I was senior director at the National Security Council for South and Central Asia. I can tell you the U.S. backed India fully, both morally, materially. We provided information. We expedited delivery of military equipment. We were, very supportive in terms of public statements. We were coordinating very closely with India. So I just need to really push back on that idea that somehow the U.S. was not supportive to India during the 2020 border crisis.
Perhaps, Dr. Shen, you'd like to address the issue of Taiwan deterrence. I think what can Taiwan do to deter Chinese attacks? Very quickly, though.
Of course, Taiwan is a small country. How to deter China's attack? There's a huge power. United States suggests Taiwan to use asymmetric warfare, asymmetric strategy. But maybe some experts said, okay, you use asymmetric, why you buy Mi-82 tank, why you buy F-16V, why you made your own submarine. I think these two things is not a contradiction, because we need to defend ourselves in the peacetime, in the wartime. Maybe in the wartime we can use many asymmetric tactic, strategy, but in peacetime we have official island. We need to send the big ship to the Pratas, to the Ituaba, to the Jinmen, Mazu. So I think our deterrence to the China, the first one is we have enough capability and can defeat it and win in the battle against China. The second one is, I think, is our people. If our people have very high fighting will to China and united together, I think is the best deterrence. As I think I want to respond our colleague question. Mr. Lin asked about which way is better, strategic ambiguity or strategic clarify. I think it's a different level. We can see that United States policy back to the Taiwan Relation Act is very clear. But how to support, how to help Taiwan against China invasion is ambiguity, because you don't have to tell anybody when breaking the war, United will send aircraft cruise ship, will send Air Force, will send the troop, something like that. You don't need to tell the whole world how you want to do. But we can see that some model in Ukraine war, provide training, provide some weapon system already done in Taiwan. So I think it's different. But I think in tactical ambiguity, it's better. But back to Taiwan Relation Act, and exactly tell the whole world that United States support Taiwan is very clear.
Daniel, I think there was a question on U.S. freedom of navigation operations and whether or not it's a little bit hypocritical or it's double standards for the United States that because it hasn't signed on to UNCLOS, to then be conducting these freedom of navigation operations?
So India is one of our closest Navy partners in the world. The country that is the greatest violator of UNCLOS is China, which took over an international body of water in the South China Sea, which carries 40% of global trade. The International Court of Justice ruled against China, and China ignored it. I would also like to comment on our colleague from Taiwan. You know, Vladimir Putin underestimated the Ukrainian people who are fighting for their freedom. We should never underestimate people fighting for their freedom. Compare the Ukrainians to the Russian conscripts' performance. When we think about Chinese aggression in Asia, we've got to bet on the side of democracies like India, Taiwan, their friends and allies, that the great mistake that authoritarian revisionists make is not understanding that people are going to fight for their freedom, and that's why I'm confident that ultimately will prevail.
Thank you. And perhaps I could also add that the United States actually takes the position that many of the provisions in UNCLOS are actually part of customary international law, and under UNCLOS, military activities within the exclusive economic zone are permissible because, as the name suggests, it's an exclusive economic zone providing economic rights and not security rights. Carl Bildt, would you like to perhaps wrap up this session and with any last thoughts?
Well, I think it illustrates, the entire discussion illustrates the magnitude of the challenges that we face in this part of the world. I think it illustrates that we need to do more perhaps on the geo-economic side of it. The US somewhat sort of left that particular space. Europe needs to do more, in my opinion. The opening it to India is a hopeful sign. I think there are more that can be done. And then it clearly illustrates that what's happening in other parts of the world does impact. It impacts directly in terms of the principles that we are depending or don't care about, and it impacts upon the sort of attention span of major powers, be that the Americans or be that the Europeans, and it also has concrete implications in terms of trade. So a region of greatly increasing significance for everyone, but a region also very much affected by what happens in the rest of the world.
Thank you very much, and thank you to my panelists. Please join me in thanking my wonderful panelists.